Most people know that one boss, teacher, or even coworker that gets one hint of authority and goes mad, absolutely buck wild with it like a LARPing dictator. This is a tale of what happened when a player got promoted and tried to leverage her new position against the DM and party, and how it came to damage her career in the end. But first, sponsor time. Wormwood craft high-end wooden gaming accessories for Dungeons & Dragons, Magic the Gathering, and many other games, all crafted in a Massachusetts workshop. They started over 10 years ago on Etsy, selling deck boxes, but they used Kickstarter to launch their first new product, a wooden dice vault. Now, Wormwood can make anything from dice vaults all the way up to high-end gaming tables. If that isn't an electrifying story of persistence and grassroots success, I don't know what is. And the dice vault I mentioned earlier, there are 3 kinds, each with their own unique uses. Carry dice, minis, and pencils in a safe, organized, but also good-looking case. While we browse their catalog of accessories, remember to use code CritCrab or CritCrabINT if you don't live in the Freedom Burger Land. Link below, see you there. That said, roll post. People can get weirdly attached to their characters, but it takes a special kind of person to take it to the point of threats and verbal assault, stalking, and sabotage. I had been DMing a game for some work friends as a way to introduce some of them to the game alongside some long-term players, so that the game would not only flow a little better, but the requirement for me as a DM to teach the game at a base level would be somewhat alleviated, so I could concentrate more on actually DMing. Now, some will say that DMing for workmates is not always a good idea, as it can lead to some IRL issues if things don't go so well. In 20 plus years of TTRPG as both a dungeon master and a player, I really had never had this issue, beyond some newfound and failed personal romantic relationships that have led to some minor issues, and then some weirdness when in-character romance led to confusion off the table. This was one of those times. Coworkers can be cool people, but D&D is even more fragile than coworker relationships, as a general rule. Depending on the circumstances, you're already one missed shift away from getting looked at with all the concentrated frustration of a crackhead without a lighter. Why add the sensitivity of a D&D game? It's counterintuitive to add another layer of complexity and emotions in a work environment. Of course, this isn't the case for most, but in this case, it's all well and good until it isn't. We're about to find out what can happen when this warning is ignored. Roll post. The game in and of itself was nothing really to write home about. A basic homebrew setup set on the Sword Coast. Some plagiarism from Neverwinter with a little Assassin's Creed and Legacy of Kain for flavor. Nothing too spicy, but enough to keep the veterans interested while being flexible enough for me as a dungeon master to make it easily accessible for the fresh players. It all came to a head a little after one of our new players, a pretty generic tiefling warlock, Becca, with a weird flair for the dramatic that I wanted to encourage. She got involved in a romantic tryst with one of my established players, a vengeance paladin, George, who was just on the verge of becoming an oathbreaker after finding out that the object of his vengeful crusade had been a fabrication of his own damaged mind, and that he had been the one to do the rather dastardly deed that put him on this path during an extended weekend of drunken debauchery, brought about from some spiked ale and a run-in with his emotionally abusive father. It was a weird backstory, a tad grim, dark, and edgy, but it seemed interesting at the time, so I went with it. This tied in quite well with our little warlock, who had a habit of mixing any and all wild and unusual herbs and random monster bits into concoctions that she would sell in town. For fun, we rolled on a random effects list, all non-lethal, with a D100 to see what the potions did, and it turned out that this leaned pretty well with her backstory and patronage to a fey trickster spirit. At this time, the story was somewhat focused on the paladin and his present ongoing self-loathing, and the party was debating if George was going to break his oath or seek those that had spiked his drink back in his hometown. Now, I know that the party were pretty much expecting me to trope this hell and have the warlock be that one that spiked the drink, etc. But I'm not that kind of DM, and I enjoy taking expectations like this and tossing them to the wind. But this one had legs, and I kind of wanted it to be more linked to the warlock's patron rather than her as an individual. Sessions passed, and we ended up venturing into the Fey realm to confront the definitely not Summer Lady and her people, which led to the Paladin taking a level in Warlock himself and focusing his vengeance on those that had actually spiked him rather than the lady herself, and form a much closer bond with the Warlock, who, in turn, started to focus more towards a Hexblade build, while the party druid and cleric respectively took bets on when the pair would hook up, and the other new player, a fighter obsessed with rats as rodents of unusual size and the disposal of them via incredible feats of violence, were pretty much the cornerstone of his own backstory. Anyways, he sought out new and unusual weapons of rodent destruction. Becca and George bonded quite a bit. So much so that it started to spill over IRL, and the pair kind of started dating. I noted with both of them that although I had no issue with this both in character and out, if it caused issues at the table for whatever reason, I would put my foot down as a dungeon master and either remove one or both of them from the game. For a while, all was well. There were no real issues until the Warlock's player got promoted at work. As our new team leader IRL, things started off brilliantly, with her able to set timetables so that we would have time off on a Saturday to play, and we could work Sundays and discuss the previous night's game in our downtime. It really was a dream come true in many respects, at least until the fighter, Sebastian, caused a bit of a ruckus during Becca and George's roleplay when he headed downstairs after a fade to black moment, and I had turned my attention to the rest of the table when they RP'd Snuggles, in quotation marks. Sebastian, as I pointed out, had a bit of an obsession with rodents, so much so that he had developed an uncanny ability, lucky perception rolls, to always know when a building was infested. He took it upon himself to deal with any scurrying pests for a nominal fee. This had been a fun way to earn some small coin, and the player had really taken to it, even considering ranger levels so he could lean into it harder. As he was a new player, this enthusiasm had to be encouraged, and thus with, snuggle time ongoing, he and the other players opted to head into the basement and play whack-a-mole with the local rodent population for fun and profit. This led to them finding out that the former owner of the inn had at one stage been an adventurer himself, and some low-level magic items had been stashed, one of which was a pretty nifty +1 rapier and +1 buckler, which, after some small debate, it was agreed the fighter should definitely keep it. The next day in real life was a little odd, as the Warlock's player seemed a lot sharper than normal and pretty much kept to herself. Nonetheless, the week passed and everything seemed normal, until the fighter player found himself scheduled to work on game night. The Warlock player offered her an apology and made it seem like this was an oversight, and said that she would go out of her way to make sure that this does not happen again. Game night came around, and with no fighter player to take part, he had agreed, at work, to simply have his characters so exhausted by the prior night's mini-adventure that he would simply pay for another night at the inn and stay in bed while we hunted the town for our paladin's antagonists, or at least some form of information related to similar incidents. It was at this time that Becca piped up and noticed that it would be a shame to leave the sleeping fighters' new shiny toys behind, when George could use them just as well or better, if we ran into trouble. I nixed this idea pretty hard and advised that he was attuning to them, and that was clearly the reason why he was so tired. And even if they could take them from the sleeping fighter, I would have to ask the player if this was okay, as it had been agreed by those that found them that the fighter should have them. She seemed okay with it at the time, so I let it pass in spite of the blatant red flag. Okay, you really thought the crab crew wouldn't notice, huh? I'll take the bait and don the tinfoil hat, but it's pretty obvious, to me at least, that the fighter being scheduled for work that day was completely deliberate. But that's the easy mystery to solve. With that out of the way, the real mystery is finding out what makes someone so insecure and petty that they need to use both real-life and in-game tactics and heist maneuvers to attempt to steal a magic item in Dungeons and Dragons. I guess we'll never understand what makes somebody that much of a total loser, as both myself and my sexy crustacean subscribers are simply occupied doing cool stuff like dancing on beaches and eating garbage. Anyways, roll post. Things went fairly smoothly, and once again the party, after a quick chat with the local guard and some sleuthing, I dropped a plot hook that would lead them out of town to a local distillery. Again, the following day, the Warlock players seemed oddly distracted and didn't want to discuss the prior night's game. So I filled in the fighter on what happened, and he seemed hyped to test out his new toys on the distillery, as it was bound to have rats. The week passes, and once again the fighter finds himself scheduled to work on game night. As I didn't want to move the game on without him, I canceled the session and opted to simply have the lads over for a drink and some pizza, with a declined offer for a one-shot as they wanted to stay focused on the game at hand. The Warlock player opted to not come, so we had a fairly silly night of Mario Kart and beer. It got to about 11 or 12, and I got chatting properly with my longtime table buddy and present Paladin player about the game. He confessed that he had mentioned feeling a bit miffed on missing out on the rat catching and a chance of a magical weapon, and had talked to the Warlock player about it during their date night. He had seemed upset that he had missed out because of snuggle time and blamed herself for the roleplay bed-based distraction. He had shrugged it off as, that's just D&D, and told her that more toys were bound to turn up. It wasn't until an hour or so later that we put two and two together. This led to a bit of a drunk dial and a bit of a blowout between them when she confessed to intentionally scheduling the fighter away from the table so that the paladin could get the magical weapons, and that she was going to bring him back when I was more fair. I'm sorry, these are all adults with jobs? No, this is kid stuff. Well, then again, I suppose the alcohol didn't help, but still, I suppose my biggest question is not how they got her to admit to the wrongdoing in the first place, but instead, what I would love to know is if there's just something that snaps in these insignificant middle managers to where they get a hint of power, and it just compels them to assert control over everyone else. Or is it just as simple as seeing everyone else as beneath them, especially their subordinates? But if you thought this was bad, she is about to go full authoritarian on them. Roll post. The following day at work was less than fun, with the Warlock player having a go at me for, quote, ruining her relationship, and warning me that if I talk about her behind her back, that I would find myself scheduled on every Saturday from this point on. I countered with, well, you will have a hard time playing the game without a dungeon master, which seemed to shut the threat down pretty damn quickly. Saturday came, and lo and behold, everyone was free to play. The scheduling issue seemingly resolved, and we got to rolling dice. Again, for a few weeks, things went well. Magic items did in fact turn up, and a story was in fact forthcoming. What also happened is that in-game snuggle time was pretty much off the table now, as the Paladin, now significantly more wary of the IRL power games that were possible, opted to keep the party together rather than engage in tabletop randiness. The Warlock was less than happy and took to sulking IRL and only paying lip service to the game before eventually opting to retire her character fully and leave the table. One would think that's where this story ends. Sadly not. With no risk of tabletop overspill, the Paladin player and former Warlock continued to date, and work-based D&D chats continued without the potential fallout and with a keen interest regarding the retired Becca and George's in-character long-distance love life, which was still more or less now an established character point due to the now combined backstory elements. This was fine, until mention of any form of Paladin-based flirting or charisma-based interactions were mentioned. He flirted with a barmaid for information in character, nothing more, and I once again found myself working a Saturday and game night being postponed. When that failed to deter the Paladin from having an in-character life once again, the fighter found himself on an odd schedule and unable to play. It was especially odd because after the first incident, we opted to keep any events regarding the game, and more specifically the Paladin, well out of earshot. Through luck or coincidence, we were able to get around the table together and get a game in with some key story events that there is no way our former Warlock could possibly have known about. That involved the forswearing of the Paladin's firstborn to his Fey patron, and a passing off-the-cuff comment regarding when they were going to do it, as he would have to ask the missus, implying that he was going to procreate with the patron herself to fulfill the bargain. And that Sunday was hell. Our former Warlock being furious that I would allow such a thing to happen when, quote, I knew the Paladin and her were still in a relationship in-game, and that I had to change it immediately, or she would again make sure that I was working every Saturday, as it no longer mattered to her as she was no longer playing. I simply said I would move to another day, and that she had no say in what happened at my table. She was less than pleased. I worked the next 3 Saturdays and moved the game to a Sunday or Friday, respectively, DMPCing the fighter under his request when he could not make the game night. Again, key events that there is no possible way she could know about kept cropping up in the form of snide remarks and curt comments. I presume that the Paladin had been letting slip or that somebody had said something, but all players at the table swore they had said nothing. It took almost 2 months to find out that she was accessing the Paladin's Google Drive and reading his notes. We only found out when he changed his phone and had to reset his Google password. A password, I should point out, that he had never shared with our former Warlock. This led to a full-on fit at work when she demanded to know what happened in-game. When I refused to answer, she called our Paladin and demanded he tell her. He refused, pulled on her on accessing his Google Drive, and after a bit of a screaming match in her office, Paladin apparently dumped her there and then as he could not trust her. Okay, we just watched like 3 layers of God complex get pissed away with all the grace of a sewer goblin on steroids. I mean, you work as a team manager, so you're already fighting an uphill battle as far as likability goes. But spitefully dragging people across schedules and thinking it's somehow effective at stifling a board game is just embarrassing. Lady, you're not God because you're in charge of a work calendar. Anyways, my favorite part of the story, the ending, is coming right up. Roll post. This doubled down when both the fighter and I requested a team transfer due to internal differences and a toxic work environment, which, thanks to her little fit, was now office public knowledge. The game was suspended for a week or two while the fighter and myself moved to another team and got our schedules aligned, and the game carried on from that point as normal. Work did get a little rough as I was being badmouthed quite aggressively, but that ended when the fighter and I started working from home thanks to the plague times, and the game moved to Discord. Suffice to say, snuggle time is now off my table between players, and as for the former Warlock player, boyfriend, lost. D&D, lost. Respect at work, lost. Friends and colleagues, lost. Due to her blow-up at work, she also lost respect and chances of leading additional teams. As she blew up in the office, she has 2 strikes now against her from our reports of toxic workplace-based behavior and verbal assault to employees, which has seen her lose her position as team lead when lockdown ended up happening, and she is unlikely to get it back due to those reports. End post.